What happens when you lose everything? What if the world you once knew suddenly crumbles and you're left with nothing? No money, no status, no power. And what if, in that moment, you were given a chance to start over, to experience life from an entirely new perspective? These were the questions swirling in Donald Trump's mind as he stared out the window of his penthouse apartment in New York City. The lights of the skyline flickered below, a constant reminder of everything he had built and lost. His name had once been synonymous with wealth, power, and influence. But tonight, it was just another lonely reflection in the glass. This wasn't just a moment of personal crisis for Trump. It was something deeper, something that had been gnawing at him for years. What if I could see the world differently, he thought. What if I could understand the struggles of the people who are forgotten by society? The ones who live on the edge every single day, with no one to help them, no one to look out for them. A strange idea began to take root in his mind. A challenge, of sorts. A test. He could disguise himself, go incognito as a homeless man, step outside of his luxurious life, and experience what it's truly like to be ignored, underestimated, and judged. No more boardrooms or red carpets. No more crowds of supporters or detractors. Just him. Just a man, trying to survive in a world that often didn't care. Trump leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest, deep in thought. I need to know how people really treat the most vulnerable. The ones who don't have the privilege of a name or a legacy, he muttered to himself. This wasn't about a stunt or publicity or any kind of political statement. This was something deeper, something that would force him to see society as it was, not through the lens of power or wealth, but through the eyes of the invisible, the forgotten. Let's see what happens, Trump finally said aloud, the challenge to himself now set in motion. He didn't tell anyone, not his family, not his closest advisors. He wanted to do this on his own, to see how the world would react when the most famous man in America, perhaps the world, became a nobody. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Trump said as though addressing an invisible audience, not realizing that this challenge would end up surprising even him. Little did he know, the test he was about to undertake would not only reveal the shocking treatment of the homeless, but would ultimately change the way he saw the world, and perhaps even himself. Trump stood up, his heart racing with anticipation. He had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of this experiment, but something inside him knew. This was going to be unlike anything he had ever done before. And so, with a final glance at his reflection in the mirror, he left his apartment behind, stepping out into the night, ready to face the streets as someone no one would recognize. To test a store, to test society, and perhaps to test himself. Donald Trump had always been a man of extremes. From the towers he built to the headlines he made, his life had been a constant roller coaster of power, influence, and scrutiny. Every room he entered, people noticed. Every decision he made, the world reacted. But for all the attention and the success, there was a nagging emptiness that Trump couldn't quite shake. He had everything, but something was missing. It wasn't until one evening, alone in his lavish Manhattan penthouse, that Trump began to reflect on a side of life he had never truly experienced, the side of life where people struggled just to survive. The homeless, the outcasts, the forgotten. The reality was stark. In all his years, in all his dealings with world leaders and business moguls, Trump had never really stopped to think about the people who lived just outside the bubble of his empire. The ones who lived on the sidewalks, beneath overpasses and shelters, those who had been pushed to the edges of society, with no chance of making a comeback. He had seen them before, of course. He'd driven past them in his gold-plated limousine, glanced at them with a sense of detachment, as if they were nothing more than fixtures in the city's landscape. But he never really saw them. Something was stirring within him now, though, a desire to understand, to feel what they felt, to see what they saw. What if he could experience their reality firsthand? What if, for just a moment, he could step away from his wealth and fame and become just another person, forgotten by the world? The idea had been simmering in his mind for days, But it wasn't until he watched a news report about the growing homelessness crisis that it fully took root. The statistics were staggering. Thousands of people without homes, many of them children, living in shelters or worse, on the streets. The social services that were meant to help them were overwhelmed, and many people were living in constant fear, unable to find a way out. It struck him like a bolt of lightning. He had the resources, the influence, and the connections to make a real difference in the lives of these people. But what if his understanding of their struggle was all wrong? What if the real story was something far more complex than he could ever imagine? He didn't want to rely on the assumptions that had guided him for so many years. He wanted to see it for himself. He needed to know what it was like to be treated like a nobody, to be invisible, to experience firsthand the fear and the cold indifference that so many homeless people faced every day. That was the turning point. Trump's idea wasn't just about helping people or making a grand philanthropic gesture. It was about testing the very fabric of society. It was about understanding human nature, how people reacted when faced with someone in need, someone who had no wealth, no fame, no power to manipulate the system. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew it was something he couldn't ignore any longer. He had to do this. As he stood in front of the mirror that night, preparing for his drastic transformation, he thought about the many relationships he had built over the years. People who had praised him, criticized him, and followed his every move. His family, his closest advisors, the millions of people who looked up to him. None of them knew this side of him. None of them knew the questions that plagued his mind, the doubts that crept in late at night when he was alone with his thoughts. But tonight, he would be someone else, someone no one would recognize. The plan was simple. He would go out on the streets of New York City. No entourage, no security, no luxury. Just him, his worn clothes, and a story he would create for himself. A man with nothing, blending in with the crowd. What would happen? Would people treat him with kindness, or would they ignore him, walk past him, judge him without a second thought? Trump didn't know. But the one thing he was certain of was this. He would find out. He gathered the items he would need. A set of tattered clothes, a weathered cap, and a scruffy beard he could grow in a matter of days. His face would be his mask, his clothes his disguise. In a matter of hours, he would no longer be Donald Trump, the businessman, the former president. He would be just another nameless soul, wandering the streets of New York. As he stood there, staring at his reflection, he realized something else, something deeper. This wasn't just about proving a point to others. This was about proving something to himself. Could he survive in a world where no one cared who he was? Could he learn to truly empathize with the people he had overlooked for so long? The next morning, Trump left his penthouse behind, stepping into the world as someone completely different. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of freedom mixed with fear. This was no longer just an experiment. It was a journey into the unknown. And as he made his way down the elevator, he couldn't shake the thought, what if the world surprises me? As the elevator doors opened, Trump stepped out into the bustling streets of New York, his disguise ready. He was about to find out. The morning air was crisp as Donald Trump, disguised as a homeless man, stepped out into the bustling streets of New York City. Gone was the gleaming suit, the tailored jacket, the polished shoes that had once been a symbol of his power and status. In their place, he wore tattered clothes, a torn jacket, and a weathered cap that shielded his face. A fake scruffy beard completed the transformation. Trump felt a strange mix of emotions as he stood on the sidewalk, blending in with the throngs of pedestrians hustling past. For the first time in years, he wasn't the man everyone recognized. He wasn't the towering figure in the boardrooms, or the man whose name graced headlines every day. He was just another face in the crowd, a nobody. The city was alive with its usual hustle and bustle. People walked with purpose, eyes fixed straight ahead, lost in their own thoughts. But no one noticed him. No one even glanced his way. Trump couldn't help but feel a pang of isolation as he shuffled along the sidewalk, moving at the pace of the crowd. It was as if he had vanished completely from their consciousness. He had always known that people in the city were busy, often too wrapped up in their own lives to notice anything else. But now, As he stood there in the shadow of the towering skyscrapers, he felt the weight of being invisible. He had read about homelessness, of course. He had seen the statistics, heard the stories, and even donated to charities in the past. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. No amount of books or documentaries could replicate the feeling of being treated as if you didn't exist. Trump continued walking, observing the people around him with a new sense of curiosity. He watched as a woman passed by, her head held high, her eyes locked straight ahead, not sparing a single glance for the man sitting on the curb. She was too busy, too absorbed in her own world. It wasn't a judgment. It was simply indifference. As he rounded a corner, Trump came across a small convenience store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as customers came and went, filling the aisles with the sounds of hurried footsteps and the rustling of plastic bags. He knew this was his first test. The moment had arrived. Trump took a deep breath, adjusting his cap to hide his face a little more. His stomach rumbled, a reminder that, despite his disguise, he was still human. He had to eat, just like everyone else. He stepped inside the store, his eyes scanning the shelves for something simple to buy. A sandwich, maybe. Some chips. Nothing extravagant. Inside, the store clerk, a young man in his 20s, glanced up briefly, then looked away. His gaze never lingered on Trump, and for a moment, it felt as though the clerk hadn't even noticed him at all. Trump approached the counter, his heart racing. This was the moment. Would the clerk treat him like any other customer, or would he be dismissed because of his appearance? He placed a sandwich and a bottle of water on the counter. The young man didn't flinch, didn't bat an eye. He just rang up the items and told Trump the total, barely acknowledging his presence. Trump fumbled for his wallet, pulling out a crumpled dollar bill. The clerk didn't seem to care. No judgment, no questioning, just the cold transaction of money for goods. As Trump left the store, a strange realization hit him. The world hadn't treated him any differently. He wasn't invisible in the way he had expected, at least not in the store. There was no scorn, no contempt, but the interaction had been devoid of warmth, too. It wasn't kindness he had experienced, but a certain kind of indifference. Outside the store, the noise of the city continued, the sounds of cars honking and people shouting in the distance. Trump took a deep breath and looked around. The experiment was just beginning, and already, he had learned something profound. The world could ignore you, not because it hated you, but because it simply didn't care. He continued down the street, the sandwich in his hand. His stomach was still empty, but his mind was racing. There was more to uncover, more people to observe, more stores to visit. His goal wasn't to expose the cruelty of society. It was to understand the dynamics of how people treated those who had nothing, how the rich and powerful were treated differently from those who were struggling to survive, and what he could do to change that. As he walked, he passed a homeless man sitting on the corner with a cardboard sign, asking for spare change. The man looked up at Trump, his eyes dull and tired, but there was a flicker of recognition. It was as if the man saw something familiar in Trump's eyes. A shared experience, however fleeting, passed between them. Trump paused for a moment, his heart heavy. He didn't offer money. He didn't speak, but the silent exchange lingered. He continued walking, but for the first time, he truly saw the man, not as a stereotype, but as a person. The day stretched on, and Trump continued his journey through the city. The more he observed, the more complex the situation seemed. Some people were kind, offering food or small gestures of help. Others didn't even look twice. But there was one thing that became increasingly clear. The world was a harsh, indifferent place for those who had nothing. And in the eyes of many, those without money, without status, were invisible. But Trump wasn't just anyone. He was used to being noticed, used to being the center of attention. Now, he was learning what it felt like to be forgotten, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could handle it. The experiment had only just begun, and already, it was pushing him to the edge of his comfort zone. As the day wore on, Trump felt the weight of his experiment growing heavier with each step he took. The streets of New York City, while always bustling and alive with energy, now felt colder and more alien. Despite the crowds, he felt more alone than he had ever been. He had expected to face a world of judgment, But what he hadn't anticipated was the suffocating silence, the complete absence of connection. He had spent hours wandering the streets, observing, making his way through parks and alleyways, sitting on benches, and even attempting to ask a few strangers for spare change. But for the most part, people treated him as if he didn't exist. They passed by without a second glance, lost in their own lives. No one seemed to care whether he was hungry, whether he was cold, whether he was even human. It was a harsh, sobering reality. But the true test came when he ventured into another store, a small, family-owned grocery store on the outskirts of Manhattan. Unlike the chain convenience store, this one had a personal feel, with wooden shelves and a smell of fresh produce wafting through the air. It wasn't just a place to grab a quick snack, it was a community hub. The kind of store where people knew each other, where conversations were exchanged, and where the owner greeted customers by name. This time, Trump's heart raced as he stepped through the door. He was no longer simply a man in a disguise. He was beginning to feel the deep discomfort of what it meant to be ignored. He hadn't planned on coming here, but something about the warmth of the place made him want to try again. As he walked through the aisles, his eyes landed on a loaf of bread, some canned soup, and a carton of milk. He wasn't sure if he could even afford these items, but his stomach growled loudly, reminding him of his hunger. The idea of asking for help crossed his mind, but that was the last thing he wanted. He wasn't here to beg for handouts. He was here to test something deeper. Trump approached the counter with his items, hoping this time would be different. The store owner, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, greeted him. "Hello there," she said. "How's your day going?" Trump hesitated. Her tone was soft, genuine. It was the first time today someone had treated him with even the smallest degree of kindness. "Good," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As she rang up his items, she glanced up at him, her smile fading slightly. For the first time today, he noticed the curiosity in her eyes. She was studying him, trying to place him. Maybe she recognized him from somewhere, he thought. But no, that was impossible. In his current state, he looked nothing like the Donald Trump people knew. "That'll be $7.50, she said, her voice a little more tentative now. "Do you need a bag?" Trump's heart skipped a beat. He reached into his pocket, only to find that he had no money. He had taken out a few crumpled bills earlier, but they were all gone now, lost somewhere along the way, or maybe just forgotten in the flurry of his thoughts. He stood there, frozen, as the woman waited for his response. What now? For a moment, he considered walking away, leaving the items behind. After all, he didn't want to put her in an awkward position. But something stopped him, the desperation that was rising inside him. Was this what it felt like to have no options, no way out? I don't have the money," Trump finally said, his voice betraying a hint of frustration. He wasn't used to this feeling, of being powerless, of being vulnerable. The woman's expression softened, her eyes filled with empathy. She didn't judge him. She didn't mock him. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "That's okay. I'll cover it for you today." Trump was taken aback. He had expected pity, avoidance, or worse, a harsh rejection. But instead, she had offered him kindness, without question. "Are you sure?" he asked, unsure whether he should accept her generosity. She smiled warmly. "Everyone has tough days. Don't worry about it. You take care of yourself, all right?" Trump's mind raced. How had this woman known exactly what he needed, without asking? How had she sensed that he wasn't just a man without money, but a man in search of understanding? With a quiet nod, he accepted the offer. The woman handed him the bag of groceries, her smile still warm. "Thank you," Trump said quietly, feeling a lump rise in his throat. It was one of the first real moments of human connection he had experienced that day. As he walked out of the store, the weight in his chest lightened, but only slightly. This woman had shown him the kindness he had been longing for, but it also made him realize just how rare it was. He had been on the streets for hours, and yet, the only kindness he had encountered was from someone who had no reason to help him, no reason to care. She didn't know who he was, didn't care about his wealth, his fame, or his legacy. She simply saw him as another person in need. Trump felt a shift within himself. The indifference he had felt earlier in the day had been replaced by a glimmer of hope, an understanding that kindness wasn't always about grand gestures, but sometimes about small acts of humanity. It was a reminder that, no matter how disconnected the world seemed, there were still people who cared. But there was still so much more to learn. This was just the beginning of his journey. The next test would be harder, he knew. But for the first time in a long while, Trump was beginning to see the world in a different light. And as he continued his journey through the city, the question lingered in his mind. What if there was more to humanity than he had ever realized? The answers, he knew, were waiting for him. The day was beginning to fade as Trump walked along the side streets of Manhattan, the sun dipping lower behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows on the pavement. Despite the kindness he had received earlier in the day from the store owner, the city felt even colder to him now. It wasn't the temperature. It was the pervasive feeling of isolation that gnawed at him. The hunger in his stomach was nothing compared to the gnawing emptiness he felt inside, a void he hadn't expected to confront on this journey. As he moved deeper into the less affluent parts of the city, the atmosphere changed. The gleaming buildings of Midtown gave way to dilapidated brownstones and storefronts that had seen better days. The faces around him seemed more hardened, the people less inclined to look up from their phones or engage with anyone. The energy had shifted from indifferent to hostile, and Trump could feel it. It was the kind of place where the streets seemed to hum with an undercurrent of danger. He hadn't intended to wander this far off the beaten path, but as he kept walking, the quiet hum of the city started to feel suffocating. The feeling of being invisible was becoming overwhelming, and he needed something to break the monotony. That's when he noticed the group of men gathered on the corner. Rough-looking bunch, dressed in worn clothes and with expressions that screamed, "Don't mess with us." They were talking amongst themselves, but as Trump passed by, one of them glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the homeless man shuffling along. Trump kept his head down, trying to avoid eye contact, but the man's gaze followed him. Slowly, almost deliberately, the man stepped forward. "Hey, you," the man called out, his voice gruff, laced with suspicion. Trump's heart skipped a beat. He froze. In his previous life, being recognized had always been an advantage. But in his current guise, recognition was dangerous. He turned, trying to maintain his composure, and saw the man walking toward him, flanked by two others. The trio had an air of authority in this part of the city, an unspoken rule that the streets belonged to them. "Where you from?" the man asked, his tone demanding an answer. Trump hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't say anything that would give him away, yet he couldn't just walk away either. The tension in the air was palpable. "Just passing through," Trump muttered, his voice rougher than he intended. The man didn't seem to buy it. He took another step closer, his gaze searching Trump's face, as though trying to read him. "Passing through? Huh? You look like you're lost, old man," the man sneered, his friends snickering behind him. Trump's eyes darted to the alleyway behind the group, weighing his options. He couldn't outrun them, not in this state. Not like this. He had no choice but to stand his ground. "Yeah, I'm just looking for a place to sleep," Trump said, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible, hoping they wouldn't sense his unease. The man chuckled darkly, exchanging a look with his companions. "You ain't from around here, are ya? We don't get many tourists looking for a bed in this neighborhood." Trump's mind raced. He couldn't afford to blow his cover now. "I've been around," he muttered, forcing his voice to steady. "Just trying to survive." For a moment, the man didn't say anything, just stared at Trump as though sizing him up. Trump could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew he had to keep his cool. One wrong move, one sign of weakness, and he could find himself in a dangerous situation. Then, the man surprised him by stepping back and giving a gruff laugh. "All right, you're not worth the trouble, old man. Just keep moving." He motioned for his friends to follow him, and the group turned to walk away. Trump let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The encounter had rattled him more than he'd expected. He was used to being in control, used to being the one with power. Now, he was just another face in the crowd, and people didn't always respond kindly to that. He continued walking, trying to shake off the encounter, but his thoughts were clouded. The experience had left him unsettled. On one hand, the group hadn't harmed him, but they had shown him something raw and unfiltered, the dangerous side of living without protection, without status. He was vulnerable, exposed, and he hated it. As the sun set and the streetlights flickered on, Trump decided it was time to find shelter for the night. The experiment had begun as a quest to understand how people treated the homeless, but now, it felt like something deeper was unfolding, something more personal. He had already learned a lot about how the world saw people like him, but the real test was how he would handle it. He wandered further into the neighborhood, his eyes scanning for a place to sleep. The city seemed different now, darker, colder, more threatening. Every alleyway and shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger, but there was no turning back. He was here to learn, to understand, and that meant fully embracing the discomfort, even when it threatened to break him. Finally, he found a quiet corner behind a storefront, hidden from the street. It wasn't much, a small nook between two buildings, but it would have to do. Trump sank down onto the cold pavement, wrapping his jacket tighter around himself for warmth. As he sat there, staring out at the city, a strange feeling washed over him. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of being cold and hungry. It was something deeper. He had once been a man who had everything: money, power, influence. But now, as he sat in the shadows, a nobody, he realized that what he had been searching for in this experiment wasn't just understanding. It was a sense of belonging, a recognition that, no matter who you were, you mattered, even when the world told you otherwise. And tonight, sitting alone on the cold, unforgiving pavement, Trump wondered if he would ever find that sense of belonging again. But there was no time to dwell on those thoughts. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more revelations, and more harsh truths about the world he had taken for granted. And he wasn't ready to quit just yet. The city seemed to hold its breath overnight. The usual hustle of Manhattan streets quieted under the veil of darkness. Trump had barely slept, his body unaccustomed to the hard pavement, the weight of uncertainty pressing on him. He had spent years as one of the most recognized men in the world, adored by some, vilified by others. But tonight, he was invisible. And in this invisibility, he was starting to feel something unexpected: vulnerability. By dawn, the city began to wake. The distant hum of traffic, the voices of early commuters, the clatter of garbage trucks, everything started to stir again. Trump rubbed his eyes, squinting against the harsh sunlight as he pulled himself to his feet. He had barely been able to sleep, but he knew there was no point in staying in the same place. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about learning. And to learn, he had to keep moving, keep exposing himself to the truth of what life was really like for those who had nothing. He stood for a moment, the weight of his situation settling in. There was no way to sugarcoat it. He had been rejected, ignored, and at times outright dismissed. But he couldn't give up now, not after what he had already witnessed. There had to be more. Trump headed toward a more familiar part of town, where he hoped he might find some answers, or at least some familiarity. The faces along the sidewalk were a blur, no one really noticing him in his ragged clothes. He wasn't famous here. He was just another homeless man. The anonymity, though unsettling, was beginning to feel strangely liberating. He approached a small coffee shop, its warm glow spilling out onto the sidewalk, tempting him with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. He hesitated before stepping inside. It was a familiar ritual from his past life. A morning coffee to start the day, to get a boost of energy, to feel human again. But now, he was no longer in control. He was the outsider. The barista, a young woman with piercings and a tired expression, looked at him as he approached the counter. Her eyes flickered over him once, before quickly turning away, perhaps too focused on the morning rush to truly see him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but detached. Trump cleared his throat, trying to project some semblance of confidence. "I'd like a coffee, please," he said, his voice hoarse from the night on the streets. The woman nodded, but then her gaze dropped to his clothes, the dirt on his face, the tiredness in his eyes. She hesitated, as though weighing something in her mind. "Do you have money?" she asked bluntly, a faint note of suspicion in her voice. Trump's heart sank. He had been expecting this, an uncomfortable moment of confrontation. In his old life, He never had to ask for anything. But now, the reality of his situation was hitting him harder than he could have imagined. He reached into his pocket, but as expected, it was empty. His stomach twisted in discomfort. "No," he said, swallowing his pride. "I don't." The barista didn't immediately respond. She studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering as if searching for any sign of deception. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed and nodded. "I'll get you the coffee," she said, her tone softer now. "But you'll need to go out back and wait for it. We don't usually serve people without money here, but it's just coffee." Trump was stunned by her generosity, but also by the lingering bitterness of her initial suspicion. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and stepped out the back door as instructed. Sitting on the small stoop behind the coffee shop, Trump let out a deep breath. He didn't know how to feel. Part of him was grateful for the coffee, the small kindness she had shown him. But another part of him, the part that had spent years at the top of the world, felt humiliated. He wasn't used to being treated this way, to being the one asking for help, to being seen as less than. His mind churned with questions. Why had she treated him like that? Why had so many others refused to even look at him? Was it because he looked like a man who had failed, who had no value? Was he nothing more than a figure of pity in their eyes? A few minutes passed before the back door opened. The barista handed him a steaming cup of coffee, her eyes avoiding his as she did so. "Here you go," she said, her voice flat. "Just try to keep out of sight. We can't have people loitering around." Trump took the coffee without a word. As the door closed behind her, he found himself standing there, staring at the cup in his hands. It was warm, comforting, but the taste of it was tainted by the reality that came with it. He had come to the city seeking answers, but so far, the only thing he had learned was that being a homeless man was about more than just surviving on the streets. It was about fighting for dignity, for respect, and most of all, for recognition as a human being. Trump took a slow sip, feeling the bitter warmth spread through him. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. He had underestimated how difficult it would be to live without the privileges he had spent his life relying on. The more he wandered these streets, the more he realized that being homeless wasn't just about having no money. It was about being erased from the world. His phone, still in his pocket, buzzed. For a moment, he forgot about his situation, his hand instinctively reaching for it. But then he remembered. He had no signal, no way to call anyone. It was another reminder that his old life, the life where he could pick up the phone and talk to anyone, anywhere, was gone. His world had shrunk to this small corner of the city, where he was just another forgotten soul. For the first time in a long while, Trump felt the weight of his choices. He had entered this experiment expecting to uncover something simple, a truth about how the world treated those who had nothing. But now, it was clear that the truth was more complex than he could have imagined. The barista had given him the coffee out of kindness, but her hesitation, her doubt, had revealed something even more important. People didn't trust those who had fallen from grace, no matter the circumstances. The moment you became invisible to the world became invisible to you. As the coffee grew colder in his hands, Trump realized that he wasn't just looking for answers anymore. He was looking for a way back to the world he had known, a world where he mattered. But the longer he spent here, in the shadow of the city, the more it seemed like that world was slipping further and further away. And with that realization, the weight of the journey grew even heavier. As Trump finished his coffee, he tossed the empty cup into the nearby trash can. The warmth had long since faded, and with it, the small comfort the drink had provided. The day was only just beginning, but it already felt like he had spent a lifetime in the streets. The cold, the hunger, the looks of disdain and suspicion, it was all becoming overwhelming. The weight of his isolation pressed down on him harder with each passing hour. But there was no turning back now. His quest had only just begun. He walked aimlessly, trying to find a sense of direction, or at least somewhere to rest. His mind kept circling back to his initial goal. He had come to the streets to learn, to test the limits of his understanding. Yet now, he wasn't sure what the lesson was. He wasn't sure if there even was one. As he wandered down a quieter block, a sudden movement caught his eye. A man, younger than Trump by a few years, was sitting on the curb in front of a small bodega. His clothes were worn but not tattered, and he held a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps, God bless." His face was drawn with exhaustion, but there was a calmness to his demeanor that intrigued Trump. The man noticed Trump approaching and offered him a small smile, one that seemed almost out of place in such a grim setting. "Hey, man," the man said, his voice low but warm. "You okay?" Trump stopped in his tracks, thrown off by the unexpected kindness. He hadn't been spoken to like that all day. His instinct was to shrug it off, to avoid getting too involved with anyone. But something about the man's eyes, full of quiet understanding, made him stop. "I'm surviving," Trump replied, his voice rough from lack of sleep and food. The man nodded, as if he understood exactly what Trump meant. He gestured to the space beside him on the curb. "Come sit. You look like you could use a break," he said, his tone inviting but not pushy. Trump hesitated for a moment, then decided to sit. The man's presence was oddly comforting, like a brief respite from the storm that had been his life for the past 24 hours. He sat down on the curb beside the stranger, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "Name's Mike," the man said, offering his hand. "You?" "John," Trump replied, taking his hand briefly. Mike nodded. "Nice to meet you, John. I've been on the streets for a while, so I know how it goes. You can only keep walking and keep moving, but sometimes it helps to just stop for a minute, you know?" Trump was taken aback. The calmness with which Mike spoke, the way he seemed to have come to terms with his situation, it was a stark contrast to Trump's own chaotic thoughts. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about his fall from grace, his desperate attempt to regain what he had lost. But Mike seemed to have accepted the harshness of life on the streets in a way that Trump couldn't yet fathom. "You been out here long?" Trump asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. "A few years," Mike answered, his gaze turning inward as he spoke. "I lost my job, then my apartment. Ended up here. It's not as bad as people think, though. Yeah, it's tough, but the people you meet, they're the ones who make it worth it. Most of us are just trying to survive, but we help each other out. You'd be surprised how many people out here are just like you. People who lost everything and don't know how to get back." Trump swallowed hard. He wasn't used to hearing someone speak so plainly about such a grim reality. He had been so caught up in his own ego, his own world of power and prestige, that he had failed to consider the deeper human connections that existed on the streets. Mike wasn't just talking about surviving. He was talking about resilience, about community. "Does it get easier?" Trump asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Mike looked at him for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "Not really. It doesn't get easier. You just get used to it. You learn to appreciate the small things, like a warm meal or a friendly face. You learn to take things one day at a time." Trump looked down at the ground, his thoughts swirling. He had heard similar things before, but hearing it from someone who had actually lived it felt different. This wasn't a motivational speech from a self-help book. This was reality. "Is it ever worth it?" Trump asked quietly. "This life? Does it ever get better?" Mike didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath and leaned back, staring out at the street. "It gets better in some ways," he said slowly. "You learn a lot about yourself. You learn about the people who will walk by without a second glance, and the ones who will give you their last dollar. But mostly, you learn that it's not about what you had before. It's about what you do now. Every day's a new chance." Trump's mind churned with those words. He had spent so many years focused on what he had lost, on the empire he once controlled. But maybe Mike was right. Maybe it wasn't about what he had lost. It was about what he could still do, even from the bottom. Just as he was about to respond, a woman approached them. She was middle-aged, her face worn with age and hardship. She stopped in front of Mike, holding out a small bag of food. "Here," she said quietly. "I've got some extras from the soup kitchen. Thought you might want it." Mike smiled at her, his gratitude evident. "Thanks, Irene. You always know how to brighten my day." The woman smiled back, her tired eyes softening. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "I will," Mike replied, nodding. "You too." As she walked away, Mike turned to Trump, holding up the bag of food. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice gentle. Trump's stomach growled in response, but his pride momentarily held him back. He had never been the kind of man to accept charity, especially from someone who lived in such dire circumstances themselves. But something inside him shifted. "Yeah," he said, his voice soft. "I could use something to eat." Mike handed him the bag, and for the first time since he had started this journey, Trump felt something other than shame. He felt a small spark of humanity, of connection. Here, on the edge of the world, he had found a moment of grace, a moment of kindness that went beyond the barriers of class, wealth, and status. As Trump ate, he couldn't help but wonder if this was what he had been missing all along. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about the connections we made, the moments we shared, and the understanding that no matter where you came from, you could always find a way to help someone else. Maybe the world wasn't as cold as he had thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope even in the most unexpected places. And with that, Trump felt a shift. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he had believed. Maybe, just maybe, this journey could lead to something more than he ever imagined. The warmth from the food and the unexpected kindness of Mike and Irene stayed with Trump long after they had parted ways. As the day wore on, he wandered through the streets of New York, but his mind was no longer consumed with frustration or bitterness. Instead, a strange sense of clarity began to form. It wasn't the clarity of a man who had all the answers, but the clarity of someone who was starting to understand that the world didn't work the way he once thought it did. He had always seen things in black and white. Success was earned through wealth, power, and influence. The homeless were simply those who had failed, those who had made bad decisions and ended up in the gutter. But now, as he walked along the gritty streets, he was beginning to see the shades of gray that connected everything. It wasn't as simple as success or failure. It wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about survival, about perseverance, and about the connections we made with others. Trump's journey had started out as an experiment, something he could use to validate his assumptions. But now, as he trudged through the streets, hungry and tired, he realized it was so much more than that. It was a quest for understanding, a search for meaning in a world that had no clear answers. He found himself at the edge of a park, a quiet oasis in the heart of the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the benches and trees. It was a peaceful place, a far cry from the chaotic, noisy streets of Manhattan. Trump paused for a moment, taking in the scene. He had always appreciated beauty in his life, but now it felt different. He wasn't just looking at the world, he was experiencing it. A few people sat on the benches, some reading, others simply staring off into space. They were all so different, different backgrounds, different stories. But in this moment, they were all part of the same world, part of the same struggle. He walked over to an empty bench and sat down, staring out at the park. The sounds of the city seemed distant here, muffled by the trees and the quiet. For a brief moment, Trump allowed himself to relax. His muscles, tense from days of walking, slowly began to loosen. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. The sound of footsteps interrupted his moment of peace. Trump opened his eyes to see a man approaching, carrying a large garbage bag. He was wearing a jacket that looked like it had seen better days, and his hair was unkempt. He walked past Trump without a word, heading toward a nearby trash can. It wasn't unusual to see people rummaging through the trash, looking for food or anything useful. But this man was different. There was a quiet dignity in his movements, a sense of purpose that Trump hadn't seen in others. The man sorted through the trash with care, picking up discarded items with precision, as though each piece mattered. Trump watched him for a moment, curious. He had seen many people in his life, business moguls, politicians, celebrities. But this man was unlike any of them. There was something in his eyes, something that reminded Trump of himself before everything changed. The man seemed to possess a kind of inner peace, a calm acceptance of his circumstances that Trump had never been able to find. Without thinking, Trump stood up and walked over to the man. The man looked up as Trump approached, but he didn't stop what he was doing. "Hey," Trump said, his voice hesitant. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" The man paused, then nodded, setting aside the piece of trash he had been inspecting. Sure, he said, his voice calm. Trump wasn't sure where to start. He had so many questions, but all of them felt like they were too much for a simple conversation. I don't really know how to put this, he began, then paused, searching for the right words. How do you live like this? How do you survive? The man smiled slightly, as if the question was both familiar and unexpected. You learn, he said simply. You learn what's important and what's not. You learn to appreciate what you have, even if it's not much. And you learn to take it one day at a time. Trump nodded slowly, taking in his words. There was something comforting about the man's response, something that made sense in a way that Trump hadn't expected. It wasn't a grand revelation or an answer to all of his questions, but it was something real, something he could understand. Do you ever wish you could go back? Trump asked quietly. Back to a time when you had everything? The man's eyes darkened for a moment, but then he shook his head. No, I've been through a lot, but I don't wish for the past. What's important is right here, right now. What I can do today. I can't change what's behind me, but I can choose what happens next. Trump felt a lump form in his throat. For a brief moment, he thought he might cry, something he hadn't done in years. The weight of his situation, the overwhelming realization that he couldn't control everything. It was a lot to bear. But the man's words stayed with him. What I can do today. Maybe that was the key. Maybe it wasn't about trying to go back to what he had lost. Maybe it was about starting over, about making the most of what he had left. As if reading his thoughts, the man gave him a small smile. We all have our story. Yours is just taking a little detour right now. Don't rush the journey. The road will lead you where you need to go. Trump stood there for a moment, letting the man's words sink in. It was strange, how a stranger could make him feel so much. And yet, there was something about the way the man had spoken. His acceptance of life, of his situation, that made Trump think that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what he needed. A detour. A chance to start over. Thanks, Trump said quietly, feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't expected. I needed that. The man nodded, then returned to his task, sorting through the trash with the same quiet determination. Trump watched him for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, his steps lighter than they had been in days. As he walked through the park, his mind felt clearer. The journey wasn't over yet, but he was beginning to understand that it didn't have to be about regaining what he'd lost. It was about what he could find in the moments that lay ahead. And with that, Trump knew that his detour, however difficult it might be, had already started to change him. The evening grew colder as Trump continued walking, but the heaviness that had settled on his shoulders earlier in the day was starting to lift. The conversation with the man in the park had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years, hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from a well-laid plan or an expected victory. It was the kind of hope that came from realizing there were possibilities even in the darkest situations. He had spent so much time chasing power, control, and wealth, believing they were the answers to everything. But now, sitting with Mike and meeting strangers like the man in the park, Trump was starting to understand that perhaps the most important things in life weren't the things you could buy or hoard. They were the things that couldn't be taken away. Your will to survive, your ability to help others, and your capacity to change. But as he walked further into the night, he couldn't deny that a nagging feeling still lingered. There was something he had to prove. He had come here to learn, to test the world he thought he knew. But now, there was a new question eating at him. Could he ever really escape the life he had known before? Could someone like him, someone who had lived in luxury and privilege for so long, really adapt to this life on the streets? Trump's thoughts were interrupted when a sharp voice broke through the fog of his mind. Hey man, you look lost. He turned to see a group of young people standing near the entrance of an alley. The leader of the group, a tall man with dark sunglasses and a leather jacket, took a few steps toward him. His friends hung back, watching Trump carefully, their eyes skeptical. Trump paused. He wasn't in the mood to get into a confrontation, but he didn't want to seem weak either. He squared his shoulders and gave the man a nod. I'm fine, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The man in the leather jacket raised an eyebrow. You sure? You don't exactly look like you're from around here. He looked Trump up and down, sizing him up. Trump didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if this was an opportunity or another test, but something in the man's demeanor suggested that this encounter could go either way. "I'm just passing through," Trump said, trying to sound casual. "Not looking for trouble." The man smiled, though it didn't seem entirely friendly. "Well, if you're passing through, you might want to know something. People around here don't always take kindly to strangers, especially ones who look like you." Trump's brow furrowed. He wasn't sure what the man meant by that, but he had a feeling it wasn't a compliment. "I'm not here to start any problems," he said again, but his words felt weaker now. The man seemed to study him for a moment, his sunglasses reflecting the dim street lights. Then, with a small chuckle, he lowered his glasses and looked Trump in the eyes. "All right then. You seem like a guy who knows how to keep his head up. That's good. Around here, you're gonna need it." Trump felt a flash of recognition. There was something familiar about this man, something that echoed the street-smart resilience he had witnessed in others like Mike. He wasn't sure if he liked this feeling, being seen as someone who belonged to this world, but there was also something oddly freeing about it. "You need anything?" the man asked, his voice softer now. "A place to stay? Something to eat?" Trump hesitated. This was a side of the streets he hadn't encountered before. He had heard about the dangers of the city, the groups that controlled certain areas, and the way things operated. But he hadn't expected to be offered help like this. "I'm okay," Trump said, though his stomach grumbled in protest. The man gave him a long look, as if weighing whether or not to push further. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but if you change your mind, my name's Dean. You can find me here, or down by the market. People like me don't forget when someone's just trying to make it." Dean turned to walk back toward his group, and Trump watched him go. There was something about the encounter that unsettled him, something that hinted at the unpredictable nature of life on the streets. He hadn't expected to be offered help so freely, but the man's kindness had felt genuine. It made Trump question everything he thought he knew about survival. As Trump made his way down the street, he kept thinking about the encounter with Dean. The way the man had spoken about survival, about people who didn't forget when someone was just trying to get by, resonated deeply with Trump. Maybe this was the real test. Maybe it wasn't about power or wealth at all. Maybe it was about relationships, trust, loyalty, the things that mattered most when you had nothing. That night, Trump found a spot to sleep in a small alley. It wasn't comfortable, but it was a place to rest, a moment of relief from the constant hustle of the day. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, trying to block out the chill, and lay down on the cold concrete. For the first time in a while, his mind didn't race with thoughts of what had been or what could have been. Instead, he allowed himself to drift off, his thoughts lingering on Dean's words. "People like me don't forget." Was that the key to surviving? To thriving? The relationships we built along the way? Trump wasn't sure yet, but as he fell into a restless sleep, one thing was clear. His journey was just beginning, and the people he met along the way, like Dean, like Mike, would be the ones to guide him toward whatever came next. And whatever that was, he would have to face it. But he wasn't so sure anymore that facing it alone was the best way to go. The world had more to offer than he had ever realized, and maybe the best path forward was the one that required the most humility, walking alongside others. For now, though, Trump closed his eyes, unsure of what the future would bring. But for the first time, he was open to finding out. The night was long and cold, but it brought Trump something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came with certainty or comfort, but the kind that came from embracing the unknown. For the first time since his life had been upended, he wasn't chasing after something. He was simply existing in the moment, experiencing the world as it was, without the lens of expectation or ego clouding his perception. The next morning, as the early morning light filtered through the gaps in the alley, Trump awoke to the sounds of the city stirring. The world was alive again. The streets that had seemed so hostile and indifferent the day before now felt different, more familiar, almost. He had become part of this world, albeit temporarily, but it was a world that was more complex, more layered than he'd ever imagined. Trump sat up, stretching his aching limbs, and rubbed his eyes. The sun had barely risen, but he knew it was time to get moving. The streets were waking up, and so was he. As he stood and adjusted his jacket, he caught sight of something. Someone. Across the street. It was Dean. Dean was walking briskly, his leather jacket pulled tight against the wind, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was talking to a woman who seemed familiar, probably someone from the area. But what caught Trump's attention was the way Dean was acting. There was a confidence in his stride, a self-assurance that wasn't rooted in arrogance but in something deeper, something earned through experience. Trump felt an impulse, a strange tug. The moment felt like one of those rare chances in life, an opportunity to take a step towards something new, something different. Before he knew it, he found himself crossing the street, his heart racing slightly with nerves he hadn't expected. Dean noticed him before Trump could even say anything. The moment their eyes met, Dean gave him a small, knowing nod. "You're up early," Dean said with a grin. "Good to see you." Trump hesitated for a moment, then smiled back. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said, about people not forgetting." Dean raised an eyebrow. "What? You think I was just giving you some speech to make you feel better?" Trump shook his head. "No. I think you were trying to tell me something." Dean's expression softened, just slightly, but Trump noticed it. It was as though the man had been tested, and yet something about him had remained grounded. There was an authenticity to Dean that Trump couldn't ignore. "Maybe I was," Dean said, his tone shifting. "It's not always about surviving on your own. Sometimes, it's about finding the right people to trust. And trust isn't something that's easy to come by. It takes time." Trump nodded, the words resonating with him more deeply than he could explain. This wasn't just about surviving on the streets. It was about navigating the chaos of life itself, about trust, loyalty, and finding your place in a world that often felt cruel and unforgiving. "I've been thinking about that too," Trump said. "About trust. And maybe I've been going about it all wrong. My whole life, I've thought I had to control everything, make the right moves, build my empire." He paused, looking down at the pavement. "But now, I don't know. Maybe it's about being part of something bigger. Maybe it's about connection." Dean's eyes softened, and he gave a slight chuckle. "Yeah, that's the thing about life. It's not about building an empire. It's about knowing you're not the only one out there trying to make it." Trump glanced at the woman Dean had been talking to. She was listening now, her eyes studying Trump with a curious, almost wary expression. Dean followed Trump's gaze and nodded. "That's Carol," he said. "She's been around here a while. You could say she knows a thing or two about surviving. You should talk to her." Trump took a breath, suddenly feeling a bit more self-conscious. The idea of talking to Carol made him uneasy. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he was still trying to figure out how to navigate his new reality. "I don't know if I have much to say," Trump muttered, scratching the back of his neck. "I'm still figuring all this out." Dean smirked. "Aren't we all? Come on, man. Trust me. You might learn something today." With a hesitant nod, Trump approached Carol, who was watching him intently. She was dressed in worn jeans and a layered hoodie, her face lined with the experiences of someone who had lived on the streets far longer than Trump had. But there was also a sharpness in her eyes, a kind of wisdom that only came from living through things most people could never understand. "Hey, Carol," Dean said casually. "This is Trump. He's new around here. He's got questions." Carol raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak immediately. She took a slow drag from the cigarette in her hand, her gaze moving from Dean to Trump. "Questions, huh?" she said after a moment. "Well, I'll tell you one thing, kid. You won't get answers if you're not ready to listen." Trump blinked, a bit thrown off by the directness of her response. But there was something about the way she spoke, the no-nonsense attitude, that made him want to hear more. "I'm listening," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Carol took another drag of her cigarette, then slowly exhaled the smoke into the chilly morning air. "All right then," she said, her voice calm but firm. "First things first. You've got to let go of whatever you think you know. The world's not going to play by the rules you're used to. You can't control it, and you sure as hell can't control people. So you better learn how to roll with it, or it's going to eat you up." Trump absorbed her words quietly, his mind processing them. The way she spoke was blunt, unfiltered, yet it carried an undeniable truth. It was a kind of wisdom that wasn't learned in boardrooms or on private jets. It was learned the hard way, on the streets where survival meant everything. "All right," Trump said after a moment. "I'll roll with it." Carol smirked, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good. You might just make it then." Trump wasn't sure if he had fully grasped what Carol meant, but he had a feeling he would understand more with time. He wasn't sure how long this journey would last or what it would ultimately lead to. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. As he walked away with Dean and Carol, he felt something shift inside him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was beginning to see it not as a challenge to conquer, but as a journey to experience. And he wasn't walking it alone anymore. Perhaps, after all, that was the most important lesson of all. The day drifted on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the city streets. Trump walked alongside Dean and Carol, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps blending with the hum of the urban landscape. It was a strange kind of tranquility, the type that only comes when you're no longer rushing towards something, when the future is uncertain, but you're not afraid of it. As they walked, Dean told Trump more about the city, about the hidden pockets of humanity that most people ignored. They passed by shops, food stalls, and busy intersections, but there was something different now. Trump wasn't just a visitor. He was part of the city, in a way, and it was as if the streets themselves were revealing their secrets to him, one step at a time. "See that diner?" Dean pointed across the street. "That's where people like us go when they need a hot meal, no questions asked. You'd be surprised how many places out here still do things the old way. Trust goes both ways. You give a little, you get a little." Trump looked over at the diner. It was a small, hole-in-the-wall type of place, the kind most people would pass by without a second glance. But there was something about it that intrigued him. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt real, like it belonged to the people who lived in the city, not some corporation that owned every other restaurant. "All right," Trump said, his voice thoughtful. "Let's go in." The door to the diner jingled as they walked in, and the warmth of the place immediately hit Trump. It smelled like fresh coffee and greasy food, the kind of place where the cook knew everyone's name. A few heads turned as they entered, but there was no hostility, just curiosity. Dean led the way to a corner booth and slid in, signaling for Trump to join him. Carol took a seat across from them, her eyes scanning the room while she tapped a finger on the table. Trump settled into the booth, feeling oddly out of place. This wasn't the type of restaurant he was used to. There were no menus with fancy logos, no polished staff, just regular people with regular lives. "What can I get you, hon?" the waitress asked, her voice warm, but also practical, like she had heard a million orders and didn't need to hear any more pleasantries. "Just coffee for now," Trump said, trying to sound casual. The waitress nodded and turned to Carol. "Same for you?" Yeah, Carol replied, not looking up from her phone. The waitress moved away, and the three of them sat in silence for a moment. Trump could feel the weight of the quiet pressing in on him. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was unfamiliar. He was used to noise, to busy rooms filled with people all trying to make their mark on the world. But here, in this small booth, there was a strange kind of peace that settled over him. "You said trust goes both ways," Trump said, breaking the silence. "What do you mean by that?" Dean leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "It's simple," he said. "People don't just hand out trust. It's earned, and you don't get to decide when you're gonna give it. Sometimes it's a slow burn. Sometimes it happens in an instant. You can't rush it. You can't fake it. But if you're lucky, you find people who get it." Trump absorbed his words. He wasn't sure if he believed it yet, but he was starting to understand. It wasn't about power, about dominating situations. It was about being real, about showing up and being honest, even when it was hard, even when it meant giving something of yourself that you weren't sure you wanted to give. "So, how do I know if I'm ready to trust?" Trump asked. He could feel the question hanging in the air, vulnerable, like he was exposing a part of himself he hadn't intended to. Carol looked up from her phone, her gaze steady. "You don't know," she said bluntly. "Not until you do it. You just have to take the leap. You trust someone, and then you see what happens. Maybe they prove you right. Maybe they prove you wrong. Either way, you learn something. It's not easy, but it's the only way. Trump sat back, processing what she said. He had spent his entire life building walls, keeping people at arm's length. The idea of trusting people, really trusting them, was foreign to him. But sitting here, in this diner, with Dean and Carol, he realized something. He didn't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe the process itself, the struggle to trust, the struggle to let go of control, was the point. The waitress returned with their coffee, placing the cups on the table. Trump reached for his, feeling the heat of the mug seep into his hands. The bitterness of the coffee was a stark contrast to the softness of the conversation, but somehow it made sense. "So, what's next?" Trump asked, looking from Dean to Carol. "Where do we go from here?" Dean gave him a thoughtful look. "Now, we see how well you handle the city. How well you learn the ropes. You've got the basics, trust, survival, the ability to roll with it. But there's one more thing you need to know." Trump raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "The most important part," Dean said, leaning forward slightly. "The people you meet along the way, they might teach you something you didn't know you needed to learn. But the thing is, you can't rush it. The city has its own rhythm. If you try to force it, you're going to get burned." Trump nodded slowly. He didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. This wasn't a race to the top. It was a journey. And maybe that was the most important lesson of all. As the waitress returned to refill their cups, Trump sat back in his seat and watched the world outside the diner. The streets were alive with people hurrying to their destinations. But here, in this small corner of the world, Trump had found something more valuable than any business deal or victory he had ever experienced. He had found connection. He had found trust. And he was starting to understand just how much that mattered. The city's got a rhythm, he thought, and I'm just beginning to hear it. The city was buzzing louder than ever as Trump, Dean, and Carol walked out of the diner. The morning had turned into early afternoon, and the streets were filled with people heading to work, running errands, or simply passing through. Trump felt like an observer, part of the hustle and bustle, yet still on the outside looking in. Dean led the way down the street, his steps confident and purposeful. Carol, as usual, kept a sharp eye on the world around her, her hand tucked into her jacket pocket as she scanned for any signs of trouble. Trump had noticed her watchful demeanor before, but it became even more apparent as they walked through more unfamiliar areas of the city. "So, what now?" Trump asked, trying to hide the growing sense of uncertainty that had been creeping in since they left the diner. He was beginning to feel the weight of the challenge ahead of him, the very thing he had set out to do. To experience the world through the eyes of someone without privilege, to understand what it was like to walk in the shoes of those who lived on the streets. "Now comes the real test," Dean said without slowing down. "You've got to put everything you've learned into action. This city doesn't care about your past or your title. It only cares about how you handle what's in front of you. The next few hours will show you whether you're ready or not." Trump frowned slightly. "Ready for what?" Dean stopped walking and turned to face him. His eyes were hard, but there was no malice there. Just the kind of intense focus Trump had come to expect from him. "The world will give you chances," Dean said, "but it'll only do that if you show up for them. It doesn't matter if you think you're prepared or not. You've got to take what's in front of you, and you've got to take it without hesitation. Trust is one thing. Action is another." Trump nodded, trying to make sense of it all. The idea of trusting the process was something he was slowly warming to, but this was different. This was about stepping into the unknown, about proving he could navigate this world not just by relying on others, but by standing on his own 2 feet. "So, what's the first move?" Trump asked. Dean smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile Trump was used to. It was the kind that suggested he was about to give Trump something he wouldn't expect, something that might throw him off balance. "You'll see," Dean said, then glanced over at Carol. "Carol, you want to explain it to him?" Carol gave him a pointed look, her lips curling into a smirk. "Yeah, I'll explain," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Basically, we're going to put you to the test. And that means you've got to step outside of your comfort zone. You'll be doing some stuff you never thought you'd have to do. But you'll be fine, right?" Trump swallowed hard. Something about Carol's confidence made the situation feel more real, Too real, maybe. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever they had in store, but there was no turning back now. "All right, I'm ready," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "What's the plan?" Carol pointed across the street at a small, nondescript storefront with a faded sign hanging above the door. The store was tucked between two larger, more modern shops, almost as if it had been forgotten by time. The windows were covered with a layer of grime, and the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting someone to step inside. "That place," Carol said. "It's one of the few spots in the city where people don't judge you by the way you look or what you've got in your pockets. But don't be fooled. They don't give anything away for free. You've got to earn it. And today, you're going to see if you've got what it takes." Trump took a deep breath. "What do you mean by earn it?" "You'll see when we get inside," Dean said. "But let me give you a piece of advice. Don't act like you know it all. You have to learn how to listen first, before you start asking for help. That's where you're going to find out if you really understand what you're doing here." With that, the three of them crossed the street, and Trump felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but there was no backing out. This was it, the test he had been preparing for. They reached the door, and Carol pushed it open, stepping inside first. The dim light inside made it hard to see at first, but Trump quickly adjusted. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper, mixed with the scent of something cooking in the back. There was a counter at the front, with a few people sitting on stools, sipping coffee and talking quietly among themselves. Behind the counter, a man in his late 50s stood wiping down the surface. He was wearing a thick apron over a worn plaid shirt, his hands large and calloused from years of work. His face was weathered, with a gruff expression that softened only slightly when he saw Carol. "Morning, Carol," the man said gruffly. "What's the kid doing here?" Carol shrugged. "He's here to learn. Thought he could use a lesson in how to get by without all his fancy tricks." The man, who Trump assumed was the owner, eyed him up and down. "Well, I'm not in the habit of handing out charity," he said bluntly, "but I'll give him a chance. If he's serious." Trump tried to steady his breath. This wasn't like anything he had done before. It wasn't about power or manipulation. It was about proving himself in a world that didn't owe him anything. The man's eyes softened just a bit, and he gestured to a small stack of crates by the side. "Take those crates out back and stack them properly," he said. "If you do it right, maybe I'll throw in a meal for you." Trump nodded, trying to hide the nervousness that was creeping into his chest. He had no idea how to stack crates, but he knew one thing. He was going to have to learn quickly. As he walked over to the crates, the man's voice called out to him. "And don't take too long. I don't got all day." Trump turned, trying to keep his voice steady. "I won't." And with that, he took his first step into a world where he would have to prove himself. Not with money, not with connections, but with grit and determination. This was his test. The weight of the wooden crates was heavier than Trump expected. His hands, accustomed to the finer things in life, were suddenly calloused with the rough edges of the wood as he carefully lifted the first one. It was awkward, but he tried not to let the discomfort show. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. As he trudged out the back door into the alley, the cool air hit him, refreshing in contrast to the heat of the cramped store. The alley was narrow, flanked by tall buildings that towered overhead, blocking out much of the sunlight. It was quiet here, aside from the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of garbage blowing in the wind. It was a world that most people walking down the street would never see, a world that was invisible, tucked away behind the more glamorous facade of the city. Trump placed the first crate down, trying to figure out where to start. There were other crates piled up against the wall, a chaotic mess of sorts, and he had no idea where to begin. This wasn't the sort of task he was used to. He was more comfortable with spreadsheets and meetings, not moving heavy, awkward objects around in the dirt. For a moment, he felt that old, familiar frustration bubble up inside him. He wasn't good at this. He wasn't trained for this. Why was he here, doing this? But then he remembered Dean's words, and the way Carol had looked at him before they came in. You have to learn how to listen first. He glanced back through the door, where he could still see the man behind the counter, watching him from inside. There was no judgment, but there was an expectation. The kind that didn't let you off the hook, no matter who you were. Focus, Trump thought. He had to learn to focus. Trump took a deep breath and began again, carefully stacking the crates against the wall. At first, it felt awkward, the wood splintering under his grip, but slowly, he got the hang of it. There was a rhythm to the task: lift, place, adjust, and repeat. The more he worked, the more his mind started to clear. He wasn't thinking about his past anymore, or the role he used to play. He was just here, in the moment, doing the work. And as the minutes ticked by, Trump found himself looking up at the small stack he had built. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than before. "Not bad," came a voice from behind him. He turned to see the man, who had come out from the back door. He was eyeing Trump's work, inspecting it with a critical but not unkind eye. Trump wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to hide the exhaustion that was starting to creep in. "Thanks," he said, feeling a strange sense of pride in the task. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The man nodded, his expression softening. "You did all right. I didn't expect you to last as long as you did." Trump didn't know if he should take that as a compliment or a jab, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the man was waiting for Trump to say something. "Do you think that was enough?" Trump asked, trying to sound casual. The man paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. "It's never enough. Not until you understand why you're doing it. The work, the people, the city itself, they don't owe you anything. You've got to earn everything. But you've taken the first step. I'll give you that." Trump absorbed his words. They were simple, but they hit harder than anything he had heard in years. This wasn't about titles or money or status. It was about earning respect, earning trust, and putting in the work when nobody was watching. "Now," the man continued, "I promised you a meal if you did the job. Come inside. Let's see if you've earned it." Trump followed the man back into the store, the tension in his shoulders easing as he entered the warmth of the diner again. The smell of cooking food filled the air, more inviting than it had been earlier. The customers at the counter were still there, chatting casually, but now Trump noticed something different. It wasn't just a place to eat, it was a part of the community. This place, these people, they weren't just surviving. They were living. The man motioned for Trump to sit at the counter. "I'll get you something to eat. You've earned it, but you'll learn something from this meal too. It's not just about filling your stomach. It's about understanding." Trump nodded, still trying to process the whirlwind of thoughts that had begun to form in his mind. He had thought he was here to test his own limits, to see how far he could go without the comforts he was used to. But now, after stacking those crates, after being shown something that wasn't about wealth or status but about grit and persistence, he realized that this was more than just a test. This was an awakening. As the man slid a plate in front of him, Trump looked down at the simple, hearty meal: eggs, toast, and bacon. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough. And it felt real. He glanced up at the man, who was watching him closely, almost as if he was waiting for something. Trump took a bite of the food, chewing slowly. There was nothing special about it, but everything about it was perfect. "This is good," Trump said, the words coming out before he could think about them. The man smirked, a hint of approval in his eyes. "It's not about the food. It's about the people who made it, and the people who eat it. There's a lesson in that if you're ready to learn it." Trump didn't say anything for a moment. He just stared down at the food, letting the quiet settle around him. The truth of the man's words sank in slowly, but it was clear. He had stepped into a world where there were no shortcuts, no easy answers. Every action, every moment, was a test. And this small, humble meal, was the first of many lessons. Trump had taken the first step. Now, he had to decide what to do with the rest of the journey. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. "The test isn't over," he thought, taking another bite. "But I'm beginning to understand the rules." As Trump continued eating, his mind was racing. The simple meal in front of him, the task of stacking crates in the alley, and the no-nonsense attitude of the man who owned the shop, it all felt surreal. He'd stepped into a world he had never truly known, one where everything wasn't about money, influence, or connections. It was about real, hard work. It was about earning. Dean and Carol sat across from him at the counter, quietly watching him eat. Carol had her usual intense expression, while Dean's face was relaxed, as if he'd been through this many times before. Trump could tell that they were waiting for him to say something, to make sense of it all. Finally, he put his fork down and met the man's gaze. "You were right. It's not just about the food," he said, his voice a little quieter than usual. "It's about something deeper. I don't know if I get it all yet, but I'm starting to understand." The man behind the counter gave him a slow nod. "That's a start. You've taken the first step, but this world, it doesn't let you rest. You can't just do one thing and think you've got it all figured out. Every day's a new challenge, a new test. You've got to keep showing up, keep working." Trump felt a pang of discomfort. He was used to the idea that success came from making the right moves at the right time, not from continuous, unrelenting effort. But here, in this moment, he realized that the game was different. The rules were different. And if he truly wanted to change, to understand the people he had once dismissed as lesser, he would have to embrace this new way of thinking. Carol broke the silence. "You've got to make it through today first," she said, her voice flat but with a hint of a challenge in it. "The meal was just the beginning. There's more ahead, and it's not going to be easy." Dean added, "You've got the grit, but that's just one piece. You've got to learn how to navigate this world. It's not just about surviving. It's about thriving, learning how to exist in it without letting it crush you." Trump's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by thriving? I thought the goal was just to make it through." Dean leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "That's where you're wrong. Making it through isn't enough. You've got to figure out how to live, to make something of yourself, even in a world that's stacked against you. The people who make it, they don't just survive. They rise above." Trump leaned back in his stool, processing the weight of Dean's words. He had spent his life thinking he was doing well. Hell, he thought he had mastered the game. But this was different. There were no shortcuts, no backroom deals to smooth things over. There was only hard work, determination, and resilience. As they continued talking, Trump felt the shift happening within him. It wasn't just a challenge of his abilities or his comfort zone. It was a challenge to his very identity. The world he had known, the one where power and money gave you control, was suddenly irrelevant. And that thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The afternoon passed in a blur of quiet conversation and the hum of the small diner. People came and went, and Trump observed it all in silence, trying to take it all in. The faces of the customers, the way they spoke to each other, the way they moved around the space. It was all so different from what he was used to. There was a certain calmness in the way they interacted, as if they had all learned to deal with life's challenges in their own quiet, personal ways. As the day wore on, the man behind the counter grew quieter, too, focusing on his work. At one point, Trump caught him looking over at him with a nod of approval. "You've done well so far," the man said. "But this isn't a job you can just coast through. You've got to be alert, always paying attention. There's always more to learn. If you're serious about making it here, you've got to be ready for anything." Trump nodded, absorbing every word. His experience in the business world had taught him a lot of lessons, but none of them had prepared him for this. None of them had prepared him for the sheer reality of life without privilege. The feeling of being invisible, the pressure to constantly prove yourself, and the deep, nagging sense that nothing is ever guaranteed. This was the world of the underdog, a world that never let you forget you were fighting just to survive. But the more Trump thought about it, the more he realized that survival was only the beginning. Surviving wasn't enough for him anymore. The people he had seen that day, working hard without asking for recognition or reward, had something Trump didn't, something he had been too blind to notice before. They had purpose. Trump didn't know where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to the way he was. Not now, not after everything he had seen and experienced. The man behind the counter set down a cup of coffee in front of him. "Here," he said. "Take a minute. Think about it. But not for too long. You've got to move." Trump took a sip of the coffee, its warmth filling him. He glanced at Dean and Carol, who had been quietly watching him. Dean gave him a small, approving nod. Carol's expression was unreadable, but Trump could see the subtle shift in her eyes. He wasn't the same person who had walked into this diner hours ago. Something had changed. He didn't know if it was enough to transform him, but he was starting to believe that, just maybe, it could be. "All right," Trump said, his voice steady. "What's next?" Carol's lips curled into a faint smile. "Now the real test begins. But this time, you'll be ready. Let's go." As they stood up, ready to face whatever came next, Trump couldn't help but feel a rush of anticipation. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. He was finally starting to understand what it meant to truly live, and he was ready for the next challenge. Trump stepped out of the diner and into the gritty, bustling street. The sky had started to darken, the faint orange of sunset painting the horizon as the world around him continued its usual frantic pace. People hurried by, some lost in their phones, others deep in conversation. The hum of the city felt distant, almost muffled compared to the quiet hum of the diner where he had just been. Carol, walking beside him, didn't say anything. Her eyes scanned the street, ever watchful, as if constantly assessing the next move in a game only she understood. Dean, on the other hand, kept glancing at Trump, his gaze less scrutinizing but still filled with expectation. "We're headed to the warehouse," Carol finally spoke, her voice clipped but purposeful. "It's not far from here. If you thought the crates were hard, just wait." Trump's stomach tightened. The day had already stretched his limits. Between learning how to handle the crates and the mental and emotional shift he had experienced, he was already feeling the weight of it all. But he wasn't going to back down, not now, not after everything he'd learned. The warehouse loomed ahead, an old building on the outskirts of the city. It was a nondescript place, hidden among rows of dilapidated shops and run-down buildings. The faint smell of grease and dust clung to the air as they approached, and Trump's instincts told him that whatever was inside would be far more than he had bargained for. As they entered, the atmosphere immediately felt different. The air was thick with the smell of machinery and sweat, and the dim lighting made it hard to see everything clearly. A group of people were working at various stations around the warehouse, some lifting heavy crates, others sorting through stacks of material, and still others building or fixing what looked like mechanical parts. There was a sense of urgency here, a rhythm of work that Trump had never experienced before. "Get to work," Dean said as he motioned to a stack of boxes in the corner. "There's no time to waste." Trump nodded, but as he walked over to the boxes, he noticed something was off. The workers weren't just moving through the tasks mechanically. There was a subtle tension in the air, an unspoken sense of competition. Everyone was rushing, everyone was focused, but there was something else too, a kind of quiet desperation. As he crouched down to lift one of the boxes, a hand clapped him on the shoulder. "Be careful," a voice said, low and gruff. Trump looked up to see an older man, his face weathered by time and hard work, his eyes sharp despite the graying hair. The man's presence was commanding without being overt. "First day?" the man asked, sizing Trump up. Trump nodded. "Yeah, just trying to keep up." The man smiled slightly, though it wasn't the kind of smile that signaled warmth. "Don't try too hard. Just do your part, and don't get in anyone's way. You're not the first one to walk in here thinking they could handle it." Trump didn't respond right away. He had heard that tone before, people who judged him based on his past, on his reputation, on what they thought he should be. He had no intention of backing down. He wasn't just trying to survive this anymore. He was determined to prove he could thrive here. As Trump grabbed a box and hoisted it onto his shoulder, he could feel the strain immediately. The box was heavy, and the effort it took to lift it was far greater than he had expected. But there was no time to hesitate. There were other people moving quickly, silently, and Trump realized that the key here wasn't just strength. It was the ability to keep pace, to match the energy of the people around him. He carried the box across the warehouse, his muscles straining with the effort, but his mind was focused. There were no shortcuts here, no excuses. He had to show them he could handle it. As he dropped the box at the designated spot, Trump wiped the sweat from his brow and looked around. The workers didn't seem to acknowledge his presence, but they were watching him in their own way, measuring his every move. There was a subtle tension in the air that Trump couldn't ignore. Everyone seemed to be watching, waiting for him to fail. Keep it up, the older man from earlier called out. Don't get distracted. Trump nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. It was clear now, this wasn't just about learning how to work hard. This was about earning the respect of the people around him. And in a place like this, respect wasn't given lightly. He moved quickly, keeping his head down and focusing on the task at hand. He lifted boxes, moved materials, and worked his way through the seemingly endless series of chores. Each task felt more exhausting than the last, but with every move, Trump felt himself gaining a deeper understanding of the world around him. The physicality of the work, the camaraderie among the workers, the quiet intensity in the air. It was all part of the same lesson he had started to learn in the diner. There were no shortcuts. There was no easy way out. You had to prove yourself. By the time the clock struck 6, Trump's body was aching. His back ached, his arms burned, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. But something inside him had shifted. He didn't feel as out of place as he had earlier. He wasn't just pretending anymore. He was living this, feeling it in his bones. Carol and Dean appeared at his side as he was finishing his last task. Carol didn't say anything, but her eyes gave him a once-over, as if evaluating whether he had truly earned his place. "Not bad," she said at last, her tone hard to read. Dean slapped him on the back with a grin. "You're starting to get it. But don't get comfortable. This is only the beginning." Trump wiped his brow, catching his breath. He wasn't sure how much more he could take, but there was a small fire burning inside him now. He wasn't the man he had been when he walked into the diner this morning. He wasn't even the man who had stepped into the warehouse an hour ago. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," he said, his voice steady. Carol gave him a sharp nod, her lips curling into a hint of approval. "We'll see about that. But remember, this isn't just about strength. It's about resilience. Can you keep going when it seems impossible? Can you stay the course, even when the odds are stacked against you?" Trump didn't answer right away. He just nodded, his body aching, his mind sharp. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. He was ready for the next test. And the next one would be even harder. The warehouse was quieter now. The hum of workers moving between tasks had slowed to a murmur, and the light outside had softened into the deep purples and pinks of dusk. It was a strange feeling, walking out of a building that felt like a world of its own, especially after spending hours among the people who lived and worked there every day. The sounds of the city continued in the distance, but it felt far removed now. Trump had never thought of himself as someone who could fit into a world like this. Hard work, long hours, no rewards other than the next task at hand. But as he stepped out into the cool evening air, he couldn't help but wonder if he was beginning to understand it, if he was starting to get it. There was something powerful in the simplicity of it all. The constant grind, the effort, the never-ending pursuit of survival. It was humbling, and yet, it gave him a new sense of purpose. But the hardest part, Trump realized, was yet to come. As Carol, Dean, and he walked down the dimly lit street, there was a silence between them that hung in the air, filled with unspoken tension. Carol had been quiet for the past few minutes, her pace brisk as always, but her mind clearly elsewhere. Dean, too, seemed deep in thought, though he had a slight smile on his face, as if proud of Trump's progress. "Do you think you're ready?" Dean finally asked, his voice calm but with a tinge of seriousness. Trump didn't answer immediately. Could he truly say that he was ready? He had completed the day's tasks. He had worked harder than he'd thought he could, and he had pushed himself further than he'd imagined. But the question Dean asked wasn't about physical effort, it was about resilience. About the mental strength to keep going, no matter what. He glanced at Dean and Carol, both of whom had clearly seen many people come and go. They'd been through the grind themselves, and they knew what it took. They weren't looking for a quick fix or a show of strength. They were looking for someone who could endure, someone who could keep moving forward when everything inside of them screamed to stop. "I don't know," Trump admitted after a long pause, "but I'm not going to quit." Carol stopped walking for a moment and turned to face him. Her eyes were sharp, assessing. "You've got to understand something," she said, her voice lower now, more intense. "This world is relentless. There's no room for weakness. If you don't have the grit to keep going when it gets hard, you won't make it here." Trump nodded. He had heard the words before, but now they felt different. He was no longer just hearing them. He was beginning to understand them. Dean spoke up again. This isn't just about working hard. It's about proving yourself. It's about showing you can be part of this world without trying to take shortcuts or lie your way through. You've got to earn respect, and you've got to stay steady, no matter what happens. Trump looked down at his hands, calloused and sore from the day's work. He had worked in business for years, making deals, climbing ladders, winning in ways that never required him to struggle physically or get his hands dirty. But today had been different. It wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about doing something with meaning. And the people around him, like Dean and Carol, had done it the hard way, without shortcuts or excuses. Then what happens next? Trump asked, his voice quieter now. Carol's expression softened, just a bit. Now comes the real test. Trump frowned. What do you mean? What could be harder than what I've just done? Carol gave him a look that almost made him second-guess his question. That's the thing. It's not about what you can physically handle. It's about what happens when the pressure becomes too much. It's about your ability to keep going when it seems like you're stuck in a place that'll never get better. Trump didn't respond right away, but a knot formed in his stomach. The pressure had already been building. He could feel it every time he picked up a box, every time he wiped sweat from his brow, every time he moved just a little faster. It had taken everything he had to push through the day. But Carol was right. This was just the beginning. They continued walking, and as they did, Trump's mind raced through the possibilities. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew that it was going to be a turning point. Whatever happened, he couldn't afford to stop now. When they reached a small park, Carol stopped. She turned to face him again, her eyes steady. You've got to make a decision. This is your moment. Will you keep going, or will you walk away? Trump's heart thudded in his chest. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just about physical work anymore. This was about something deeper, something more personal. It was about choosing the path forward, and whether or not he could face the challenges that were waiting for him. I'm not going anywhere, Trump said, his voice firm. Carol's lips twitched upward, just slightly, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Trump knew what was at stake now. This wasn't about impressing anyone or proving himself to them. This was about proving something to himself. Dean spoke up then, his voice calm but with an edge of finality. Good. Because the next few days are going to be even tougher. If you think this was hard, wait till you see what's ahead. But if you can stick with it, if you can keep going when the rest of the world is falling apart around you, then maybe you'll make it. Trump looked at both of them. He knew they weren't just giving him empty words of encouragement. They were preparing him for something more. Let's go, Carol said, already turning toward the street. Tomorrow's a new day. As they walked away from the park, Trump felt the weight of what lay ahead. But for the first time since he had entered this world, he felt ready for it. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming something more. The sun had barely begun to rise when Trump received the text. His phone buzzed with the same jarring intensity that had become all too familiar in the past few days. He rubbed his eyes, still bleary from a restless night. Despite the exhaustion that seemed to seep into his bones after each long day, sleep had evaded him, leaving him with nothing but the buzzing thoughts of what lay ahead. It was a message from Carol. Meet me at the warehouse in 30 minutes. This is the real test. Trump's heart skipped a beat. The real test. He had no idea what that meant, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not after everything he had been through. As he rushed to get ready, the weight of what he was about to face loomed over him. The last few days had pushed him physically, mentally, and emotionally. He had learned the ropes of manual labor, broken down walls in his own mind, and faced challenges he had never imagined. But Carol's words told him that today would be different. Today, the stakes were higher. By the time he arrived at the warehouse, the place seemed almost eerily quiet. The usual hum of activity was absent, and the stillness sent a chill down Trump's spine. It was like walking into an empty battlefield, each step reverberating in the silence. Carol and Dean stood by the entrance, their expressions unreadable. There were no greetings, no casual remarks. The tension between them was palpable. Ready? Carol asked, her tone flat. Trump gave a quick nod, though his stomach was a mix of nerves and anticipation. He wasn't ready for whatever this test would be, but he had to show up. He had to try. "You're going to work with a new crew today," Dean explained. "These guys, they don't have patience for mistakes. You'll need to prove you belong here, or you'll be out. Simple as that." Trump swallowed hard. He had faced difficult people before, but this was different. This wasn't a room full of suits and salespeople. These were people who lived and breathed this life, and they wouldn't hesitate to dismiss anyone who couldn't keep up. Carol's eyes sharpened as she added, "Don't expect anyone to cut you slack. They'll test your limits. They'll push you until you break. And if you break, it's over." Trump nodded again, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. This wasn't going to be just another day. This was the point where he would either sink or swim. They led him to a different section of the warehouse, where a new group of workers were gathered. There were 6 of them, all of whom eyed Trump with the same cold scrutiny. They didn't speak, didn't welcome him in any way. In fact, they seemed more annoyed by his presence than anything. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard and a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. "You the new guy?" His voice was rough, his gaze harsh. "Yeah," Trump said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm here to work." The man scoffed and looked him up and down. "We'll see about that." He turned to the rest of the group. "All right, listen up. We've got a lot of work to do, and we don't have time for anyone who's going to slow us down. Get in line, do your part, and keep your head down." Trump joined the crew, and the work began almost immediately. The tasks were grueling. Moving crates from one side of the warehouse to the other, breaking down materials, organizing parts that seemed to multiply the longer they were handled. The physical toll was immediate, but what was worse was the pressure to keep pace with the others. They moved quickly, seamlessly, their bodies and minds locked into a rhythm that Trump struggled to match. For the first hour, he felt like he was always a step behind. His hands ached, sweat stung his eyes, and his muscles screamed in protest with each movement. Every time he fumbled, he could feel the eyes of the workers on him, silently judging his every move. "You're slow," the man with the scar said as Trump dropped a crate a little too hard. "You've got to pick it up. We don't have time for mistakes." Trump's face flushed with embarrassment, but he bit back any retort. He couldn't afford to get distracted. If he wanted to prove himself, he had to push through the pain and keep moving. But as the hours wore on, something inside him began to crack. He could feel the exhaustion creeping in, the fatigue dragging him down. The work was never-ending, the demands relentless. He kept his head down, did his best to keep up, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he wanted to quit, when he questioned if it was even worth it. It wasn't until the sun began to set that he realized how much of his energy had been drained. His body felt like it was made of lead. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but there was no time for that. The work didn't stop, and neither could he. Then it happened. In the middle of lifting a particularly heavy crate, Trump's vision blurred for a second. His grip slipped, and the crate toppled to the ground with a deafening crash. The noise echoed through the warehouse, drawing immediate attention. The scarred man appeared at Trump's side in an instant. "You can't even handle a simple box?" he barked. "What the hell are you doing here?" Trump froze, the harsh words landing like a slap. He could feel the eyes of the others on him, waiting for him to respond. The moment felt like it stretched on forever. And then, something inside him snapped. He stood up, dusting himself off, and met the scarred man's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," Trump said, his voice steady despite the wave of exhaustion crashing over him. "And I'm not going to stop." The scarred man didn't say anything at first, but after a moment, he let out a low chuckle. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. We'll see how long it lasts." Trump didn't respond. He didn't need to. The test wasn't about what he could do in the moment. It was about what he could withstand. It was about proving to himself that he could survive, that he could endure, no matter how hard things got. The rest of the day passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion, but Trump kept pushing. He didn't stop. He didn't give up. By the time the shift ended, his body was broken, his energy spent, but there was a sense of quiet victory inside him. He had made it through the test, barely, but he had made it. Carol and Dean were waiting for him when he walked out, their faces unreadable. But Trump didn't need words. He knew what the look on Carol's face meant. He had passed. Just barely, but he had passed. And the next test would be even harder. Trump's legs felt like jelly as he trudged out of the warehouse, his body heavy from hours of grueling work. Every muscle ached, and his shoulders throbbed from the weight of the crates he had carried. The day's events had been a blur of exhaustion, but beneath the physical toll, a sense of accomplishment began to take root. He had survived. But deep down, Trump knew that survival wasn't enough. The pressure was mounting, and the next challenge would demand even more of him. More strength, more patience, and more endurance than he had ever known. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him like a shock to his system. The contrast between the harsh warehouse and the quiet night almost overwhelming. He didn't look up right away, but instead focused on putting one foot in front of the other, forcing his tired body to keep moving. Carol and Dean were waiting by the street corner, their expressions unreadable. They had witnessed everything. Ready for tomorrow? Carol's voice was blunt, her tone as sharp as ever. Trump gave a tired nod. I made it through today. I'm not giving up now. Dean gave him a long look, and for a brief moment, Trump could see the same judgment he had felt all day reflected in his eyes. But then Dean spoke, his voice low. It's not about giving up. It's about staying in the game long enough to see it through. You've got grit. But tomorrow, you're going to need more than that. Trump didn't ask what Dean meant. He didn't need to. There was always more. There was always a higher bar to reach, another hurdle to clear. He had known that for as long as he could remember. Carol turned toward the street and motioned for him to follow. Let's get something to eat, she said. You'll need your strength. The three of them walked down the street in silence, the city's lights casting long shadows as they moved. Trump could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about learning, growing, and proving something to himself. Something he hadn't fully understood until now. They reached a small diner at the end of the block, a no-frills spot where the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation filled the air. The familiar scent of fried food and coffee hung in the air, and for a brief moment, it felt like normal. Like he was just another person eating dinner, not someone trying to break through the barriers of his own limitations. They sat at a booth in the back, the noise around them fading into the background as Carol slid into the seat across from Trump, Dean beside her. The waitress came by, took their orders without a word, and disappeared back into the kitchen. You're doing well, Trump, Carol said, breaking the silence. Better than I thought you would. Trump couldn't help but let out a short laugh, though it was laced with exhaustion. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Carol didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. It's not about making you feel better. It's about telling you that you've done more than most would have. But tomorrow, we turn the heat up. Trump raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. Tomorrow's about accountability. We're going to put you in charge of a task, and you'll have to lead the team. You'll have to make the hard decisions. And the hardest part? You'll have to hold yourself accountable for every single mistake. Trump stared at her for a moment, feeling the weight of her words settle on his chest. Leading a team? He had led organizations, made deals, climbed to the top of the corporate ladder. But this was different. This was about more than just giving orders and delegating tasks. This was about real responsibility, real consequences. And if I screw up? Trump asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Carol's gaze didn't waver. Then you'll have to own it. No excuses. No shortcuts. And if you can't handle that, then you'll know you're not cut out for this. Trump swallowed hard. He had always prided himself on his ability to lead, to make decisions quickly and decisively. But in this world, it wasn't about just making the right call. It was about the impact of that decision on the people around him. It was about the weight of every choice, every mistake. You think I'm ready for that? He asked, his voice quieter now. Dean spoke up, his voice surprisingly gentle. You've got the heart for it, but heart's not enough. You've got to have the spine to follow through, to lead when it's hard, and to take responsibility when it's easy to point fingers. Trump leaned back in his seat, digesting the magnitude of what they were saying. This was the moment. The moment where everything he had done, every hour spent lifting crates, every drop of sweat, every ache in his bones, would be put to the test. The waitress returned with their food, setting it down in front of them with a smile, but Trump barely noticed. His mind was too focused on the task ahead. He wasn't just part of the crew anymore. He wasn't just a worker. He was stepping into a new role, a role that would demand everything from him. The conversation shifted to the details of the day ahead, but Trump could barely focus on it. He was too deep in his thoughts, his mind racing with the possibilities, with the fear of failure, and with the realization that this was his chance to prove something. Not just to Carol, not just to Dean, but to himself. As they finished their meal and walked out of the diner, the weight of the night seemed to press harder on him. The pressure, the uncertainty, it was all coming to a head. And tomorrow, when he stepped into the role of leader, he would either sink or swim. But as he looked at Carol and Dean, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to sink. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Trump barely slept, his mind replaying every conversation, every lesson, and every moment of doubt from the previous days. As much as he tried to calm his racing thoughts, there was no denying the truth. Today would be the day that defined everything. The warehouse loomed in the early morning light, still and silent. The sharp clang of metal echoed from within as the crew began their shifts, setting the tone for another brutal day of work. But today, Trump wasn't just a worker. Today, he would step up, take charge, and make decisions that could change everything for the team. When Trump arrived at the warehouse, Carol and Dean were already waiting by the entrance, their faces as unreadable as ever. Trump could feel the tension in the air, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like 100-ton weight. "Ready?" Carol asked, her voice cool and calm, but there was something in her eyes, something that conveyed a silent challenge. "Remember, today isn't about how much work you can do. It's about how well you can lead." Trump swallowed hard. "I'm ready." Dean gave him a long look. "You won't get a second chance, Trump. There's no turning back now." Trump nodded, trying to steady his nerves. There was no turning back. There was only forward. Inside the warehouse, the crew had already started their work, moving with precision and efficiency, just as they had done the day before. The hum of activity filled the space, but the workers kept their distance from Trump, as if waiting to see what he would do. "Your team," Carol said, gesturing toward the group of workers, "is ready for you. The task today is critical. You need to make sure everything goes smoothly. Any mistakes, and it'll be on you." Trump looked over the group, his eyes narrowing as he sized them up. The pressure of their eyes on him was unmistakable. They were watching, waiting, looking for any sign of weakness. Carol continued, "We're moving a shipment of sensitive materials today. The timing has to be perfect, the organization flawless. There are a lot of people depending on this. You're in charge of making sure everything gets done without a hitch. You'll be calling the shots." Trump's heart began to race. This was it, the moment where he would either sink or swim. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than he ever expected. But in that moment, something inside him clicked. He wasn't just here to survive anymore. He was here to lead. "Understood," Trump said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Carol nodded and gave him a slight smile. "Good. You've got this." With that, she stepped back, leaving Trump to take control. The workers continued their tasks, but Trump could feel the shift. The air was thick with anticipation as he stepped forward, gathering his thoughts. "All right," Trump began, his voice carrying through the warehouse. "I need everyone's attention." The workers stopped what they were doing, their eyes focusing on him. The energy in the room shifted, and Trump could feel the weight of their gazes. This wasn't the boardroom. This wasn't a negotiation. This was raw, real, and it all depended on his ability to lead them through it. "We've got a big job today," Trump continued. "A shipment of sensitive materials is being moved, and we need to get it done fast. There's no room for mistakes. I'm counting on all of you to make sure everything goes according to plan." He paused, scanning their faces. Some of them looked skeptical. Others were waiting for him to falter. But Trump stood tall, refusing to let doubt take root. He wasn't here to prove himself to anyone else. He was here to prove it to himself. "I know we've had our issues in the past," Trump went on, his voice firm but sincere. But today, we move forward. I'm not here to micromanage. I trust you all to do your jobs. But if something goes wrong, it's on me. I take responsibility for this. He paused again, allowing his words to sink in. Now, let's get this done. We're a team. And today, we prove it. The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. But slowly, one by one, the workers nodded, their expressions hardening with determination. They weren't just hearing the words. Trump could see that they were feeling them. They understood the gravity of the situation. "All right," the scarred man from yesterday said, his voice gruff but respectful. "Let's get to work." With that, the team moved into action, the atmosphere shifting as everyone fell into their roles. Trump watched them for a moment, his mind racing with the logistics of the task ahead. There were so many moving parts, so many things that could go wrong. But he knew that if he kept his focus, if he could stay ahead of the game, they could pull it off. As the morning passed, the task proved to be more difficult than Trump had anticipated. The shipment needed to be carefully moved from one part of the warehouse to another, but there were unforeseen obstacles along the way. One of the crates was damaged during transit, and another fell off the loading dock, spilling its contents across the floor. In that moment, Trump's instincts kicked in. He immediately called for a halt to the operation, his eyes scanning the scene for the quickest solution. "Get the backup crew in here now," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to clean this up before we move another crate." The workers moved quickly, jumping into action without hesitation. The scarred man took charge of the cleanup, barking orders, while Trump supervised, ensuring that everything was back on track. Despite the setbacks, the crew responded to his leadership. There was no argument, no hesitation, just action. But just as they were getting back on track, another issue arose. One of the crates containing sensitive materials had been mislabeled, leading to a potential security breach. Trump's mind raced as he processed the situation. This wasn't just about losing time. It was about the consequences of a mistake. He stepped forward, his mind sharp. "Who handled this crate?" he demanded. One of the younger workers, looking nervous, stepped up. "It was me, boss. I thought it was the right one, but I made a mistake." Trump's mind spun for a moment, the weight of the responsibility heavy on his shoulders. But instead of reacting with frustration, he took a deep breath. "All right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Mistakes happen, but we need to fix it now. Get that crate moved to the back and get me the right one. We don't have time to waste." The worker nodded, and within moments, the crate was moved to the proper location. As the hours wore on, the pressure only increased. The crew worked faster, but the mistakes seemed to multiply. With each error, Trump's resolve strengthened. He knew that the success of the day didn't depend on perfection. It depended on his ability to adapt, to solve problems on the fly, and to keep the team moving forward. By the time the last crate was moved, the day had been a whirlwind of mistakes, corrections, and small victories. Trump was exhausted, his mind and body worn out, but there was a sense of quiet pride in his chest. Despite everything that had gone wrong, despite the pressure and the doubts, they had made it through. As the last of the workers filed out of the warehouse, Trump stood alone for a moment, taking in the scene. The job was done, and somehow, he had led them to the finish line. Dean and Carol walked up to him, their faces unreadable as always. Carol looked at him, her eyes searching. "You did it," she said simply. Trump nodded, though he knew the real test had only just begun. The day had been a success, but there were many more challenges ahead, and he would need to be ready for them. "Thanks," Trump replied, his voice steady but filled with the weight of everything that had happened. "But it's not over. Not by a long shot." Carol gave him a small smile. "That's the spirit. Keep it up, Trump. You've got a long way to go." And with that, the door to the warehouse closed behind them, signaling the end of the day's work and the beginning of something much bigger. The days after the leadership test felt like a blur to Trump. His mind was constantly replaying every decision he made, every mistake he corrected, every moment of doubt that almost consumed him. The feeling of exhaustion never quite left him, and yet there was a sense of pride, a quiet satisfaction that came with surviving the day and leading the team through it. He had learned a lot, more than he expected. more than he had ever imagined he would learn in a place like this. Carol and Dean had both been quiet since the day's trial, but there was something different in their eyes now. Something that suggested they were no longer waiting for him to fail. They were watching him more closely, but with a new kind of respect. That respect, however, came with a price. There was no slowing down, no resting on his laurels. If anything, the expectations had only increased. Trump stood outside the warehouse the next morning, feeling the early morning chill bite at his skin. The warehouse loomed before him, a cold, unforgiving structure, but today he didn't feel the same unease that had gripped him the first time he stepped inside. Today, he was prepared, at least, as prepared as one could be in a world that seemed to change with every passing minute. The day's task was far from easy. The warehouse was getting ready to ship a large order to a high-profile client, and there was no margin for error. The team had to ensure everything was sorted, labeled, and shipped out without any mistakes. This wasn't just a test of his leadership, it was a test of his ability to stay calm under pressure, to think on his feet, and to make the right decisions when everything felt like it was on the verge of falling apart. He met Carol and Dean at the front of the warehouse, and as always, their eyes were sharp, watching him closely. "Today's going to be a little different," Carol said, her voice steady but not without an edge. "The client expects perfection. If something goes wrong, it won't just be on you. It'll be on the whole team. Everyone's counting on you to make sure everything goes smoothly." Trump felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The weight of responsibility was heavier now, and he wasn't sure how much more he could take. But there was no turning back. He had learned that much already. "Understood," Trump said, his voice firm. Dean leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't just about getting it done anymore. It's about making the tough calls. Don't second-guess yourself. If something goes wrong, own it and fix it fast. Don't hesitate." Trump nodded, though the advice weighed heavily on him. He had to be quick, confident, and decisive. But what if he made the wrong choice? What if his decision made everything worse? "I can do this," Trump whispered to himself, trying to silence the growing doubts. Carol turned to him, her gaze unreadable. "Let's see." With that, they entered the warehouse, where the rest of the crew was already gathered, preparing for the shipment. The team was quieter today, the pressure hanging over them like a storm cloud. No one spoke unless spoken to, and everyone's movements were sharp and deliberate. Trump noticed that the crew was looking at him differently now. They were waiting for him to lead, to guide them through this critical moment. He stepped forward, taking a deep breath as he faced them. "All right, team," Trump began, his voice carrying through the warehouse. "We've got a big task ahead of us today, a shipment for a major client, and they expect nothing less than perfection. I know the pressure's on, but we've done this before. I trust each and every one of you to do your part." He looked around, meeting the eyes of each worker. The scarred man nodded, while the younger workers looked to him with a mixture of hope and expectation. "But," Trump continued, his tone firm, "if something goes wrong, I'm the one who's responsible. I'm the one who will take the heat for it. But I'm also the one who will fix it, no matter what. No mistakes, no excuses. We do this right. Got it?" The team responded with a chorus of nods and murmurs of agreement. Trump felt a small surge of confidence. This was it, the moment where everything he had worked for, everything he had learned, was about to come together. The hours flew by in a blur of activity. Boxes were loaded, sorted, and organized with military precision. Trump moved from one part of the warehouse to another, checking in on the team, ensuring everything was running smoothly. He kept a close eye on every detail, refusing to let even the smallest mistake slide. But as the day wore on, the pressure began to mount. Small hiccups occurred, things that would have been brushed off in any other situation. A crate was mislabeled. A forklift ran low on fuel. A shipment was delayed because of a miscommunication. But none of it could be ignored, not today. Trump's mind raced as he worked to solve each issue as it arose. He called in the maintenance crew to refuel the forklift, had the mislabeling fixed immediately, and corrected the communication error by addressing the team directly and making sure everyone was on the same page. With each challenge, his resolve hardened. There was no room for failure, not today. Finally, as the last crates were loaded onto the trucks and the shipment was ready to go, Trump felt the weight of the day start to lift. He had done it. They had done it. The shipment was perfect, and the team had followed his lead every step of the way. As the trucks pulled out of the warehouse, Carol and Dean approached him, their expressions still unreadable. "You did good, Trump," Carol said, her voice softer than usual. "I knew you could handle it." Trump let out a deep breath, his body sagging with relief. "Thanks, but it's not over yet. There's still more to do." Dean clapped him on the back. "You've got the hang of it now. You can't let up, though. The real test is staying consistent. Don't rest on your laurels. Keep pushing." Trump nodded. He understood. This was just the beginning. As the crew filtered out of the warehouse, Trump remained standing, staring at the empty space. It was quiet now, too quiet. The chaos of the day had subsided, leaving him alone with his thoughts. But there was something new in the air, a sense of quiet confidence. The pressure hadn't broken him. It hadn't even come close. For the first time since stepping into the warehouse, Trump felt like he truly belonged here, like he had earned the right to lead. And tomorrow, when the next challenge came, he would face it head-on, ready to take on whatever came his way. There was no turning back. The road to redemption was just beginning, and Trump was ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of constant challenges. With each passing day, Trump found himself stepping up to the plate, making decisions that, at one point, would have been far beyond his scope. He was no longer the outsider or the rookie. He had proven himself to the crew. He had faced setbacks, made mistakes, and learned from them. But now, the final test loomed, bigger than anything he had faced before. This time, it wasn't just about managing a warehouse or overseeing a shipment. It was about the future of the entire operation. The company was about to undergo a crucial deal, a massive contract with one of the biggest clients they had ever landed. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was crushing. The atmosphere in the warehouse had changed. The usual rhythm of work was now intertwined with an undercurrent of tension. Everyone was on edge, aware that this deal, this final project, could either make or break the company. And once again, the responsibility fell squarely on Trump's shoulders. Carol and Dean were already waiting for him at the front of the warehouse when he arrived that morning, their faces unreadable. "Today is it?" Carol said, her voice steady but serious. "This isn't just a shipment. This is the deal of a lifetime. If this goes well, it could change everything. If it doesn't, we may not survive." Trump felt his heart skip a beat. This wasn't like the previous days. This wasn't just a test of his leadership skills. It was a test of everything. This deal could determine whether the company succeeded or failed. Dean stepped forward, his eyes piercing. "We've been watching you, Trump. You've handled everything we've thrown at you so far, but today, it's all on the line. The team trusts you, but you have to prove to yourself that you can carry them through this. Don't let us down." Trump swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He had been through hell and back to get here. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. "I won't let you down," Trump said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. With that, they entered the warehouse, where the team was already waiting. The workers moved with urgency today, their faces tense, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of weakness. Trump could feel the pressure building, and he knew that now wasn't the time for mistakes. This was the moment he had been preparing for. "All right, listen up," Trump said, his voice cutting through the noise of the warehouse. "This is the big one. We've got one shot at this, and I need every one of you at your best. The client is counting on us, and we can't afford any mistakes. We move fast, we move smart, and we move together." He paused, scanning the crew. The scarred man gave him a nod, and the younger workers looked to him with a mix of determination and expectation. Trump felt the weight of their trust on him, and he refused to falter. "The job is simple," Trump continued, his voice unwavering. "We have to get this shipment ready and shipped out by noon. It's going to be tight, but we've done harder things. We know what we're doing. Just stay focused and do your part." The workers nodded, and for the first time in a long while, Trump felt a quiet calm settle over him. He had done his part. He had earned their respect, and now they were counting on him. The hours passed in a blur of activity. Boxes were packed, labeled, and sorted. Trump moved quickly from one section of the warehouse to another, checking on everything, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. The pressure never let up, but he remained calm, trusting in the team and in himself. As the deadline approached, there was no room for error. A small mistake had been made. One of the crates had been mispackaged, but Trump caught it just in time. He quickly had it corrected, making sure it was fixed before it could cause any further problems. At exactly noon, everything was ready. The trucks were lined up, the shipment was sealed, and the team was waiting for his final word. Trump stood in front of the warehouse, watching as the trucks pulled out one by one, carrying the future of the company with them. Carol and Dean stood beside him, their eyes watching the trucks disappear into the distance. "Well done, Trump," Carol said, her voice filled with something that bordered on pride. "You pulled it off." Trump let out a deep breath, his body heavy with exhaustion but light with relief. "We pulled it off. All of us." Dean nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've earned your place here, Trump. You've proven you can handle whatever comes your way." For a moment, the weight of everything, the failures, the struggles, the doubts, seemed to lift. Trump had done it. He had led the team through one of the most crucial moments in the company's history, and they had succeeded. But as the moment of triumph passed, Trump couldn't help but think about the future. This was just one victory. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, more tests. The road ahead was long, and he knew that he would have to keep pushing, keep growing, and keep proving that he was the leader the company needed. As the warehouse fell silent, Trump looked out at the empty lot, feeling a strange sense of fulfillment. He had made it this far, and no matter what came next, he was ready. Carol and Dean turned to leave, but before they did, Carol looked back at him. "You've come a long way, Trump," she said, "but this is just the beginning. Keep your eyes on the future." Trump nodded, watching them walk away. As he stood there, alone in the empty warehouse, he knew that the road ahead would be just as challenging as the one he had already traveled. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had proven himself. He had earned his place. And whatever the future held, he was ready to face it head-on. This was his story, his redemption, and it was just the beginning.